I'm Sally Elton-Charcraft, and I'm the director of the Learning, Education and Development Research Centre. And we've got, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Steve Chubb, who is going to present at our lightning talk. And these are regular occurrences, these lightning talks. We've been running them since the first lockdown, actually, in about March or April, and they've become very, very popular and very well attended as well. And it just gives us a bit of breathing space, and it's also good as an opportunity for us to listen to one of our colleagues talk about their work, and an opportunity for us to ask questions and learn about research, basically the process as well as the content. So I'm going to chair, so I'm going to invite Steve to start his lightning talk, which he says is about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion, but if there isn't, I'll pick on people, drawing on my primary school career, and then we'll finish at about 10 to 5 to 1, because quite a few of us are going off to other meetings, and I know various members of this group are also going off to do teaching and so on. So I'm delighted to welcome everybody. It's really good, and they've been very, very well attended, so that's great. And I can see your support for your colleague, for Steve, so that's really nice as well. We are recording this session, so if you don't want your picture, then just you know, turn your camera off. If I could ask everybody to turn their microphone off while Steve is talking, please, and I will ask you to turn your microphone back on if you want to ask a question, or if you'd rather not, then you can just type your question in the chat box, and I will field those for Steve. So without further ado, over to you, Steve. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks for coming, everybody. It's nice to see you all, and thanks to my secondary colleagues for their support. It's nice to see so many of you here, and I know we've all got marking on them at the moment. So greetings from sunny Morecambe. I hope everyone's okay where you are. And for this talk, I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. Some of the ones I've been attending haven't used PowerPoints, and just a sort of brief outline of the research. So that's what I'm planning to do, and I hope that works for you all. Most of you know me, I think, but for those of you that don't, I'll just briefly introduce myself. So I work in the Institute of Education, in secondary education in particular, which is actually relevant to this research, as you'll see later. My speciality is in geography, and I've been doing that here for 20 years. And before that, I was a geography teacher for 10 years. So I've got a big interest in geography as a subject, the curriculum itself, the subject content, and so on. And those ideas have all fed through into this research. I thought about trying to do something sort of radical and new and different for today, but as often is the case, I sort of ran out of time. So if you forgive me, this is going to be a fairly straightforward presentation in looking at some key ideas from my PhD research that was finished at this time last year, and just going through some of the key lessons learned and some of the what I felt were the key outcomes that I wanted to share. So that's the idea. So I'm going to talk about the idea itself, where that came from, what I was trying to address, the theory I used, the research process briefly, and some of the key lessons learned, and obviously some of the conclusions. With the conclusions and the outcomes, I'm aiming to use some of the actual direct quotes from the people who are actually the stars of the research, who are the teachers. And anyone who's done research in schools with teachers will know that they are great people to work with. They always come up with great answers, great responses, interesting ideas, and so on. And I found that to be the case. So one or two of the teachers were incredibly quote worthy, and I could have written a whole thing based on just one or two people, to be honest. So I had to be careful and try and incorporate everybody else as well. But I got some really great material from a lot of the teachers. So that's what I'm planning to do. And just to remind you of the title, it was The Impact of a New National Curriculum on Subject Leaders in Primary and Secondary Schools. I was always worried about the plural there, the schools. It's correct because there was a primary and a secondary, but I worried that some people would think there were loads of schools, whereas in fact it was a small case study looking at one secondary school and one feeder primary school. So I, on purpose, chose 2 schools that have to do the national curriculum, so they're not academies, and they're linked, which brought up ideas to do with transitions and links between the schools as well, which was quite interesting. I said also I was a secondary specialist, and that was interesting for me because I ended up researching in a primary school as well. And I went in there quite open-minded because I haven't really worked in primary schools, and I didn't really know what I was going to find there, to be honest. And that was a really interesting element for me. It meant I had to do a lot of background work on primary schools and primary curriculum to get up to speed. But that was really interesting. Okay, so I'll move on. Before I move on, I've just noticed Professor Pete Boyd has joined us, so I'd like to publicly thank him for all his help. He's my supervisor on this research, so I'd like to thank Pete. He was very patient with me. And Dave McLaughlin's here as well, and I'd like to thank Dave as my line manager for helping me supporting me getting it finished last year. So thank you, Dave. Okay, so where did the idea come from? Well, I started the PhD in a really interesting time period in education because it was just after the review of the current national curriculum as it was announced in 2011, and just before the draft was published in 2013. So I started in the middle of that, and I've had a long interest in curricula and national curricula, thinking about what it's actually for. Does it have any impact? What impact does it have on teachers? And equally, why do governments bother changing it? Because it's a lot of work, isn't it, to change a national curriculum, which all governments do, by the way. If you look at the history of it, every time there's a new government, there's a new national curriculum. So why do they bother, and what are they hoping to get out of it? So that's where the whole thing started. Originally, it was a policy research thing. I was interested in the curriculum itself as a document. But the more I thought about it, and the more I spoke to teachers, I realized my interest was more in the actual impact it had. So did it actually make any difference to teachers in their work? How did they manage it? Did they ignore it? Did they use their own subject expertise to try and weave a way through it? Or did they do exactly what they were told and adopt it completely, and so on? So that was the background to the research. You know, what impact did it actually have on teachers? I found there's some really interesting stuff out there on national curriculum as policy, which some of you will know, and I'll just give you a couple of quotes from 1 or 2 people. Chitty commented, "It's a major source of shame and embarrassment that national curriculum has been changed by so many successive governments." And John White said, "The short history of the national curriculum has been a lesson in how not to organise an educational system." So those are my starting points, really. The fact that it changes so regularly is not something necessarily to be proud of. And I wondered, how do teachers manage all this change? The reason I went into primary schools is I had a conversation with a secondary science teacher who noted that in the new science curriculum, a lot of material had been sort of moved down from Key Stage 4 into Key Stage 3, supposedly to make it tougher and raise the standards. And she felt the same was true of Key Stage 2 in primary schools. So she felt a lot of material was being moved down into primary and wondered what impact that was going to have in primary schools. The same is true of other subjects as well, obviously. And that sort of sparked my interest. I think originally I was going to focus on secondary schools and Key Stage 3. But that really got me interested in, well, what is the impact at primary? And I sort of pushed myself in a way to look into a new area. And that was an interesting idea. But it was, in fact, the primary school where most of my results came out to be quite interesting. So I'm pleased I did look into primary. And I suppose the lesson from all of that was, in the early days, I spent a year kicking around different ideas and approaches. And it just reminds us, I think, that research is iterative and an ongoing process in the early days, and you have to be responsive. And I found myself sort of redefining early on what it was exactly I wanted to look at, which led to the research in these 2 schools. Okay, moving on. I knew I wanted to talk to teachers, so that led me to think about a qualitative approach and interviews. I chose semi-structured individual interviews with the teachers in the school. I didn't feel it was insider research as I didn't work with them, but it was sort of research as I'm an education specialist and I knew of the schools, but they didn't really know me, which I think was useful. And I interviewed them on their own turf in quiet places in the school. The theory I wanted to use caused me a lot of thinking and a lot of dead ends, as I think it does with every researcher. I explored lots of avenues in the early days. I thought about teacher agency quite a lot, you know, all the research around the ability of teachers to determine their own work and do things the way they want to. I moved away from that because I was still interested in the document as a policy document as well. I also thought about something called symbolic interactionism, which is a sort of area of phenomenology, which treats objects as symbols and so on. And I did think the national curriculum fitted that idea, but again, the more I looked into it, it didn't quite match what I wanted to look at. I ended up by looking at something Pete put me onto, which was Bernstein's pedagogic device theory, which is the sort of cornerstone of the research, really. It's not easy stuff. I regretted it sometimes. The book is quite hard work. But basically, Bernstein says, or try to analyse how knowledge is generated is then recontextualised by governments and schools and exam boards, and then ends up being delivered in schools. So he talks about the relay of knowledge through this process and how societies try to recreate themselves by passing on the correct knowledge into schools so that the society isn't challenged and changed by radical thought and so on. The more I read about this and thought about it and read around the big body of knowledge on and research on Bernstein, this really seemed to fit what I was doing, because I was interested in why the new government had created a new curriculum, and obviously was it trying to recreate a certain view of society and push that into schools, and how then did the teachers deal with it. So while it was hard work, I felt this theory was really interesting. Also, the theory, the more I read about it, it didn't say much about assessment, or it didn't seem to say so much about assessment and evaluation. And that got me thinking about, well, how do those elements fit into the final process? How do we assess knowledge in school? Bernstein separated curriculum and pedagogy out, which was interesting for me as well. That actually came up in my Viva. I had quite a tough question on that area. So I haven't really looked at pedagogy at all. I haven't looked at how it is taught in school. It was just the impact of this curriculum on teachers. Okay, so that's the pedagogy device. It's quite a big concept, obviously, to summarise in a couple of minutes, but I hope you got flavour of it there. And Bernstein felt, by the way, that societies were quite conservative. They were trying to recreate themselves through this process. And he called the first part of the process the generation of thinkable knowledge. So what are we allowed to think in schools and so on? This leads down a whole other world of the nature of knowledge, and that's a massive area, obviously, which I touched on in my research, looking at Michael Young's work and the social realist group and so on, about what knowledge should be included in schools. But I'll leave that for now. That's a whole other area. So I knew what the theory I was going to use, and I was going to use that theory to analyse the results of the interviews. So I wasn't going to sort of do deductive coding or deductive thematic analysis. That was all inductive. I just generated themes from the codes from the interviews, and then I analysed them using, with reference, I should say, to the theory. So that was my approach, and I called it a sort of hybrid thematic analysis. It's not quite. I sort of made that term up a little bit in that sense, but I inductively generated 5 themes from the research, which I'll explain in a second, and then analysed them using the device, and came up with some interesting ideas about assessment. So I'll move on quickly. So with the interviews, as I said, I interviewed a range of subject leaders in the 2 schools. The original idea was to interview every subject leader in both schools, and I thought therefore I would have about 20 quite long subject interviews. It didn't work out like that. Research never does. You have to adapt and change and so on. And the research process put me in touch with the key idea of the gatekeeper, the person who controls access to the research field, which in my case were the 2 head teachers. And both head teachers were quite happy for me to get involved and approach their staff, but one was much more active than the other. So one head teacher was quite passive and just said, I'm happy with it and I'll talk to you, but then it's up to the staff if they want to talk to you or not. And I realized that just because you ask nicely, staff don't always want to talk to you, which was a bit of an issue. So in one of the schools, I only ended up with 5 interviews, which was a bit of an issue, but was enough for what I wanted to do. The other school, the head teacher was much more active in the process, took a great level of interest, helped me arrange the interviews. And in that school, I did talk to about 10 staff, and that really worked well. So that just highlighted the gatekeeper role and how what they do is a major part of the research. So I managed to do the research. It proved to me that you need a backup plan. I did ponder approaching a different school for the to build up the numbers, but I realized that would cause a lot of problems of comparison in the analysis because I really wanted to know how the school worked. So I had enough interviews in the end. I had 14 and that seemed to work. So I used a thematic analysis approach, which many of you will know of, based on Braun and Clarke's work. It seemed to work quite well. It's seen in many ways as a fairly straightforward approach to analysis, but it isn't. It's just as rigorous as others if you do it properly, I discovered. It involved a lot of coding, a lot of theme generation. I ended up with 5 themes. I'll just quickly go through them. So remember, the research was, what is the impact of a curriculum on subject leaders? And the themes generated suggested the ways in which subject leaders deal with the national curriculum. So theme 1 was the subject leader perspectives on the new national curriculum. What's their actual view on a curriculum? Do they think it's political? What do they think of the actual content? Are they happy with it? And so on. Theme 2 was, what is the influence of the school itself, the school ethos? And that came out particularly of the primary school, where nearly everybody I spoke to agreed the head teacher had a very strong vision for the school, was very creative, supported the arts, and wasn't going to be dominated by English and maths. And that led to a whole school ethos and so on, which was really interesting. Theme 3 was the influence of the subject leader philosophy and their experience. So how experienced were the teachers? I did feel that the more experienced the teacher, the more willing they were to follow their own vision of the subject and to resist the national curriculum if they could. So their own philosophy and experience mattered. Theme 4 was the key one, really. I called it assessment backwash. What are the impacts of external assessment and monitoring on curriculum? So Ofsted and SATs, what impact do they have? And that seemed to be the key area for this research. And finally, theme 5 was the pupils and the local context. Were teachers aware of their own pupils and where their school was, and how did that affect what they wanted to do and achieve where they could? So those were the 5 themes. I'm nearly finished, Sally, don't panic. We're aware of the time. So the stars of the research were the teachers. They're incredibly quotable, really helpful, and I'm really grateful to them for their work. I'll just give you a couple of quotes to sort of highlight some of the results that I found. So the primary head of English, the subject leader for English, said that the content is a lot harder than it was before. So things that were coming in at an older age are now coming in at a lower age. Things are, so there's much more content, which makes it difficult, and it's now at a higher level, so it's much tougher. And that was a flavour of the primary curriculum. The secondary English teacher felt that the curriculum change was overtly political. It was all about ideology and philosophy, not about learning, and we have to do our best to make the document about learning, which was a common theme from some. And I'll just give you one last quote from the English teacher in the primary school, which is perhaps the key point. In year 6, we went straight into trying to make sure we had all the coverage there, ready to get through some tests to prove we taught the curriculum. And that was a key point, really. And the science teacher in the primary school made the same thing, that since science SATs had stopped, the pressure to get through the science curriculum had lessened, and they had quite so much, had more time for maths and English. So this was my conclusion, really. Based on what the teachers told me, at Key Stage 3, they felt the national curriculum hadn't had much impact on them because they felt quite safe in what they were doing. They were clear about their own philosophy, what they felt their subject was about. And as long as they were preparing for GCSE, then they could adapt the national curriculum to fit in with their ideas. They weren't tested on it. And equally, they felt that when Ofsted came in, they hardly mentioned it at all. So the external monitoring at Key Stage 3 was quite weak. And as a result, as in many secondary schools, it's led at this school to a 2-year Key Stage 3 and a 3-year GCSE programme, because that's where they are assessed. And that would be one area of future research. That change in curriculum is really interesting. However, it was very different in the primary school, and all you primary staff out there won't be surprised at this. The impact of both Ofsted and the English and Maths SATs meant that they were being tested and had to cover the curriculum to allow to be successful in the SATs in particular. And the other subjects that weren't assessed in the same way were suffering time-wise because English and Maths were dominating Year 6 so much. Now, I know most people know this, but as a researcher new to primary, I was quite shocked at the impact this was having on the primary school, how upset they were. The English and Maths specialist got very emotional in the interviews, as did the head teacher. So it was quite, there was a lot that could have been said that I left out, and there was a lot to learn there. So what this said to me and what my research suggested, and I'm aware it's a small case study, I do know that, I was only looking at 2 schools, but assessment is obviously a key part of national curriculum change. And if you just leave it to teachers and so on, they will adapt it as we would all expect, because they have agency, they do know what they want to cover and what they should cover. And if you are going to make sure a national curriculum has the impact that the government perhaps intended, you're going to have to assess it in some way. And that seems quite clear. Now, in my Viva, my 2 assessors were quite shocked by that and said, is that what I was suggesting? And it's not at all. So I made sure in my write-up, it doesn't say that that's necessarily a good idea, but that might be the only way it's going to happen. And the final point is that leads back to Bernstein's theory of the pedagogic device. And I suggested in my research that at the part of the device, which is a sort of linear relay of knowledge, I suggested a feedback loop at the end of the device using assessment and evaluation to show whether it has actually succeeded in the relay through to the school at the final point. So I think I've talked for quite long enough, and I'll finish there. I hope that was interesting.
No, that was great. That was really good. Thank you, Steve. Lots to think about. I've been frantically writing ideas down. Has anybody got a first question? While you're formulating them, I'm happy to start. Your hand up, the little hand thing, and remember to put it down. Steve, oh, somebody did. Is that Dave?
Yep.
Yeah, off you go, Dave.
You touched on it at the end, Steve. That was really interesting. Thank you for that. You touched at the end about the pressure that was related to SATs. I'm interested, did you feel there was a sense of pressure right down the school with having shunted everything back down the stage, in terms of that increased knowledge and skill requirement?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Dave. What I found at the primary school was the big difference. I mean, this is where the whole thing started for me in a way. The big difference in the new curriculum in terms of content that's listed in the document. So if you look at like art and music, there's hardly anything there really. And I wondered what they didn't feel so much pressure. They were quite happy about that. They said they felt that gave them the ability to cover what they wanted. But all of the other subjects like history, geography, science, English and maths, they were feeling the pressure of added content and higher levels of content as well that they had to get through, and then also deal with the time needed for English and maths. What I didn't say in my talk, which was interesting, was both schools had recently been Ofsteded. They'd both been inspected. And at the primary school, particularly in geography and history, even though they didn't have SATs, they felt they were given quite a hard time by the Ofsted inspector about the level of knowledge they were covering, and the pupils were being asked questions like what is history and what is geography to check they had been doing it enough. So they were feeling the pressure. I hope this answers the question. They were feeling the pressure of both depth and breadth. So they were getting the sort of depth thing on the SATs in English and maths and having to give that a lot of time. And then Ofsted were coming in and checking they were actually covering the rest of the curriculum in enough detail as well. And so all of that was adding to the pressure. And yeah, the head teacher there was finding it very difficult. So, you know, how on earth have we got time to do all these things and then get told off by Ofsted because they didn't feel they were spending enough time on, say, geography. So yeah, I think there was a lot of pressure there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Any other questions? Okay, I was very interested in a lot of what you were saying, but in particular, this whole idea of looking into a new area and pushing yourself into a new area, and also the use that you made of gatekeepers. So can you talk a little bit about the reflexivity and how reflective you were in pushing yourself and the learning journey of a PhD student? So pushing yourself, learning new things, being surprised, all that kind of thing, because there might be people here who are quite interested in starting this journey.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ali. Yeah, I mean, reflexivity as a sort of new research at this level, I found quite a difficult concept. I think as many people do. And the more you read about it, the more that there is to know, isn't there? Yeah, it was interesting because I felt I sort of had some agency myself as a secondary ex-teacher, and that if I approached a secondary school, they would just think, oh, you know, this guy's, he knows us and he knows what he's doing and so on, and we'll work with him. But it didn't quite work like that. And I wondered if it worked the other way around, that perhaps teachers felt this guy might be coming in to give us a hard time or ask us hard questions and so on. And so I was sort of reflective about that, I think, in what was my position with respect to them. And perhaps I was a bit naive at the start, to be honest. I just thought I'll ask people and they'll say yes because they're, you know, they're aware of what I'm doing. But it was much more complicated than that. And I think I had to start thinking about how confident the person I was asking would be about being interviewed. And I might, you know, they might think I was going to give them a hard time. And were they able to criticize their school or the government's program in a thing that was going to be publicly available in the end? In the primary school, because I was going in quite open-minded. I mean, I knew of primary schools, obviously, but I hadn't really been aware of the impact of SATs and on the time and so on. To answer the other part of your question about pushing myself into a new area, that in a way it came about by accident, Sally. The more I thought about it at the early stages, I realised I was going to have to go into a primary school as well to really get the full picture. And once I'd agreed on that, I had to approach loads of schools, and I went in quite as an outsider, I suppose, which may have helped in some ways. They didn't know me at all. Yeah, it was hard because there was lots of things I realised there were lots of things I was aware of from my job that I didn't really know about. So things like the Rose Review, for example, I knew about and I was vaguely aware of it, but I had to go back to that and look at it in much more detail and start to read up a lot more about primary curriculum matters. And yeah, that's been a real learning journey, and it's been of great interest, really.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. I know Pete's got his hand up, and while Pete's asking his question, if other people could formulate a question, that would be great, because we try and make these sessions as inclusive as possible. So even if you don't want to say them out loud, put them in the chat box. So Pete and then John Corkwell. Thanks.
Yeah, Steve, thanks very much. I wanted to ask you, I hope you don't mind, it's sort of tangential to your research in a way, was you've got your PhD, right? You're a teacher educator in a professional field, and you've got a PhD. So you've had about a year since then. So do you think you're just a teacher educator with a badge, or has it changed your way of working or your way of thinking about your work or anything like that? And I'm just going to sneak in a second question. I sort of lost my geography. I started out with you, didn't I, as a geography specialist, and I wandered away from it, and I regret that in some ways. But everybody, as a teacher educator, you're forced to be a jack of all trades in some ways, and you know, other people listening might be interested in the idea of focus in their career. You know, a scholarship that's very deep rather than jack of all trades like me. I wonder what you feel about your PhD moving slightly away from, I know it started with the idea of geography, but it moved away to the wider curriculum thing. So two things: are you just a teacher educator with a badge, and do you feel that you're wandering from your subject, or what do you feel about that?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Good, tough question. I think I do partly feel I am teacher educator with a badge. I think it does. You know, I'm not making a big thing about it, but it does show, I guess, some sort of self-confidence in the ability to research, and that you do know what you're talking about in a particular area. So I think it's more confidence, really. It gives you and others perhaps the confidence that actually I have looked into this in some depth. It's made me more confident about sort of trying to push this further. So I am trying to generate some sort of journal articles out of it, which is everyone tries to, but it's difficult time-wise. Which also means you have the horror of going back to reread it again, which after the Viva I sort of left it for a few months, but I have gone back to it, and I'm obviously quite proud of most of it. But also it's led me to other research. I've just started trying to do a small other research project based on secondary education. So I think the confidence is there. In terms of the subject, I think it's inevitable that you do start to move away from your subject a little bit. I mean, I've tried to hang on to it in various ways. One reason I moved away from geography with this was, as you all know, and as others know, in most subjects, there's a massive group of researchers already there. And I think in terms of geography curriculum, I felt the field was quite crowded already. And, if I was going to do something, I had to do something quite different. So that led me into the idea of the curriculum in a more general sense, I think, which has now got me thinking more about, we've discussed ourselves the whole concept of the powerful knowledge debate, and going down that road, and curriculum more generally, which has really sort of generated an interest. One thing I should have said in my talk, actually, which was I had written to say in the conclusion bit, one thing that nobody said was any criticism of a national curriculum. It's quite interesting that all the teachers accepted it, and it just seems to be part of the furniture of education now. Nobody said, do we need one, or why do we have it in the first place? So I think that debate in a way has moved on, but then the government at the moment don't insist on it being included in every school, as we know. So it's in a bit of a limbo at the moment, but we'll see what happens in the future. I hope that answers your question, Pete.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Pete. Really, really good questions. Thank you. John Corkwell, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. It's really interesting that. I'm just looking at. I think it was the third of your themes. You had 5 themes, I think you brought out of it, and the third one was about sort of more experienced teachers and leaders of subject tended to sort of more secure in not maybe jumping with a new national curriculum. And it's just something that sort of I identified with. I taught for 20 years, and my first year of teaching was when the national curriculum started. So I went through about 3 different versions, and I did tend to find that people who've been around longer tended to be much more sort of relaxed about it in a way, and would just sort of, they would pay attention to it, but they wouldn't become like, the be all and end all. And I think that that's true as well with all these other initiatives that governments bring in, because I've noticed in some schools when I go in, people don't know whether they're coming or going, because from the senior leaders have adapted a certain approach to a new initiative. And yet when you get maybe more experienced ones, one who've been there a long time and seen it a few times, they tend to create a different atmosphere in the school. And I don't know if that's something that you sort of saw in your research as well, maybe what the loss of the school was regarding the national curriculum and how you implement it.
No, that's a really good point, John, and I totally agree. And if in all the reading I did for this, there's obviously a fair bit of research out there on the implementation of policies in schools and teacher reactions to policies of different types, not just national curriculum, but new innovations and so on. And they all say similar things, that teachers, not in a negative way, but teachers often tend to resist things because, especially experienced teachers, have some sense of what they're trying to achieve and what should be in their subject and what works and so on. So I totally agree with that. That was much more evident in the secondary school. I think the subject leaders I spoke to in the secondary school all had a very reasonable amount of experience and have been doing the job for a while. And the other thing I didn't mention was, as part of that theme, I touched on department ethos as well. So those subject leaders in the secondary school were leading their departments, and they were sort of trusted by their departments to get on with it and lead them as subject experts. And the head teacher at the secondary school was happy about that in a way and left them to it. In the primary school, obviously departments don't exist in quite the same way, and they're much more fluid and work much more closely together. So I think the influence of the experienced head teacher was much more important, and she was very keen to create to have a creative school curriculum, lots of arts and music and so on. And so that was her vision, was that yes, we've got to pass the SATs and succeed and cover the curriculum. We need to try and make sure we keep everything. The subject leaders at the primary school were largely relatively new to their posts, I think, and they did seem much happier to be led by the head teacher or by what they felt was in the curriculum. So yeah, there was a difference there. I mean, Bernstein talks about this actually, which is another aspect of his theory about the divisions between departments and subjects and the boundaries between them. And the primary school obviously has very fluid boundaries between subjects and works more as a sort of a topic-based approach, whereas secondary schools, you've got quite strong boundaries between subjects. And that was one thing that the primary school found difficult, because Ofsted were coming in, and I mean, most primary school teachers think the topic-based approach works and cross-subject approaches work, and yet Ofsted were coming in and sort of demanding a subject-based approach like in the national curriculum, which was making it quite hard for them. So yeah, I think that area was quite an interesting one, and did touch on the whole idea of teacher agency, which I mentioned, which is a whole other. I could have done this whole research on teacher agency, I guess, but yeah, I definitely felt that was an important area, John.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Dave McLaughlin had a question. Dave, do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to ask it?
Yeah, it was just I was thinking, Steve, if you were as a result of your research, if you were a consultant to the DFE and they were considering restructuring the curriculum, what would your guidance be to them based on the research that you've done?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, as I said, it touched on something that came out in my Viva. They asked me about the assessor said, if you think about what you're saying, are you suggesting that all subjects should be assessed to make sure that the curriculum is covered? Which I wasn't suggesting at all. I was just saying that if you want the curriculum to be fully delivered, then somehow it needs to be assessed. It would seem to me. I think based on what I found in this research, I would suggest that if you're going to have a national curriculum at all, and I have been swayed towards that to an extent. The Michael Young and his gang have convinced me of some of their arguments, I think, in my reading. So if you're going to have a national curriculum, I would argue that you need perhaps a very slimmed down version. So along the lines of what has been written for art and music, which is quite small and limited, and perhaps just outline a few key areas and then trust teachers to get on with it and develop it from there. If you compare art and music in the current national curriculum to English and maths, the difference is astonishing, isn't it? And the amount, particularly in primary, the amount English and maths are expected to cover, and at that level, is almost impossible, they would argue. So I think slimming it down, obviously, if you keep slimming it down, you get to a point where you would argue, what's the point of having it at all? But I do feel some guidance is useful. The other aspect that's part of this, which Pete and I discussed a few times, is, of course, some teachers, and some of them said this in the research, they actually welcome them. They're quite happy to have some guidance and to give some direction. So I think the idea that you get from some writers that a national curriculum is in itself a bad idea, you know, some would disagree with anyway, but some teachers I think are happy to have a bit of guidance and a bit of direction. So yeah, if you're going to have one at all, I would argue perhaps a sort of slimmed down key points approach is best, and then trust teachers to get on with it and bring their own views on it to bear.
That's great. Is that okay, Dave?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just had a secondary part of it was thinking about your comments when you were giving the brief about teachers feeling stressed and that heavier sort of content was being brought down the curriculum to earlier ages. So this was generating a lot of additional work and pressure. But the whole purpose of the curriculum is so that children should learn at a particular age. And I just wondered, is there any evidence that the breadth and the depth of the curriculum has been, you know, in terms of learning, has been improved in any way, or has it just been a stress situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the comment about material being moved down through the curriculum is definitely true, and you can see it in most of the subjects, and I can see it in geography as well. I mean, most of the teachers were a bit negative about that and said that was just a knee-jerk reaction at political level to show that standards were being raised, and everything I read on that suggested that doesn't work. You know, that is just a very simplistic way of looking at how people learn and levels they're at. So in that sense, it didn't seem to work. I'm not sure about the impact on actual results. I don't think, I mean, I didn't go into that, to be honest. And the research itself is from 3 years ago, so that's getting a bit dated now. But I don't think it's had a major impact from what I can see. I mean, the other thing is, once you start looking at the different subjects, you see some real strange anomalies and so on. And the one that was very interesting to me was history, which many of you will have looked at. And the history curriculum is just really strange, that they sort of start back with prehistory and Romans right back at Key Stage 1, come up to 1066 at the end of primary, and they're supposed to stop at 1066, and then Key Stage 3 is supposed to carry on from 1066. I mean, it just doesn't really make a great deal of sense pedagogically, but that's what's been asked, and some of the teachers found that a bit strange. Yeah, to answer your question, Dave, I'm not sure it's had much impact, and the research I read was a bit sceptical about what impact it's going to have. I mean, it does raise the whole question of whether we need one at all or not, doesn't it? And that's a whole big area, I think.
Can I just intervene, because I'm just aware of the time, and I know Paul has got a question, and also Pete had got a couple of questions. You might just have to choose one, Pete, and then if anyone else has got a question, please put your hands up. Thank you, Paula.
Hi, so many questions. This is my bag, but the one I thought that I'd be interested in knowing is just if you could just talk a little bit more about assessment. So, in my experience of being in primary schools, being a subject leader, being a head, etc., you know, I've got so many questions for you. But one of the sort of old adages that we used to have is, obviously, you know, maths and English is taught really well because it's assessed, and so there's that sort of you really want all subjects to be taught well. And there was a real obvious dip in the quality of science teaching when science wasn't assessed anymore. Apart from obviously in outstanding schools, and then that links to the ethos of the school, and that's a whole other area which I'm really interested to ask you more about. But what would be your answer in terms of assessment? So should we have no assessment? Because I think assessing just 2 areas is quite provocative. Unless we do say, okay, actually at primary, English and maths is what gives you the keys to then go on and learn in other subjects. So hopefully there's a question in there. Do you see what I'm getting at? Because I quite like more subjects, but juggling it and doing it well is hard. I think the rationale behind history is because Michael Gove wanted us to learn everything. So he thought, well, if we do it in chronological order, that would be the only way that we as teachers would be able to wrap our tiny brains around, you know, such a big subject. The fact that we've been teaching invaders and settlers and all sorts of things for years quite successfully was irrelevant. That was it. We were only allowed to do up to 1066 and not the things that we thought the children might actually be interested in.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, I mean, I'll say first of all that feel free to email me separately if you want to get, you know, I'm happy to have a conversation about anything. And certainly for me, talking to a primary specialist would be is obviously of interest. Yeah, I hope you all noticed I was very good. I didn't mention Mr. Gove at all in my discussion, and although his name did crop up a few times in the research. Yeah, the history one's a whole other area, isn't it? But fascinating. Yeah, with assessment, I felt that I mean, the maths and English obviously was being covered to more depth and in more detail because of the assessment. I got the feeling from those two teachers that the assessment was too high a level as well, and there was too much being asked of pupils. And I think the English specialist said the maths specialist said they had to get everything right. You know, there's no half measures anymore or teacher judgments. And one of my schools was a fairly deprived area, and the staff were very unhappy with the sort of imposition of what was being expected of the pupils, and there was no sense of context, which is why that became one of my themes. So perhaps assessment works, as you say, and again, it's an interesting angle that assessment in itself isn't necessarily a negative thing, which may be some may feel. Assessment is the thing. So some assessment can be useful. Perhaps assessment of all subjects to an extent may be useful. Should that be teacher assessment? I don't know. Would that be suitable? Would that be effective? I got the feeling that was what they were saying in the primary school I looked at, that, you know, we know how our pupils are doing. We can assess them. We don't need this pressure. And we don't, in year 6, we don't have time for anything else because we can't let our pupils down, was their view, obviously, that we have to do our very best for them to succeed moving forward to secondary school. And so everything else goes out the window. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, there was a quote just before I finished writing up, there were a couple of quotes came out of government about SATs and or it's to do with science. And there was a quote when the Key Stage 3 SATs went, saying something along the lines of, we're not sure how useful they are and so on. But we're going to keep them at Key Stage 2, which I thought was really interesting comment. So there's a whole range of contradictions in this affair, isn't there? And I must admit I'm not sure what the answer is, but to answer the question, certainly assessment had an impact. Yeah.
Sally,
sorry?
can I ask a follow on?
You can ask something if it's very, very short. But Pete, did you want to ask something, or can I let Paula? No. Okay, Paula, you ask your question then.
So then that makes me ask about Key Stage 3. So the other sort of old wives' tale is, you know, that secondary schools don't really understand primary schools and all the good work that they do. And I've worked in some fantastic schools. I've worked in some mediocre schools as well. And fantastic schools send the children up just so smart, so capable. And a lot of that is to do with the new curriculum. You know, some of the mastery approaches to maths have been fantastic, you know, in terms of making sure the key concepts are covered in a practical way, etc., blah, 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 early on. But then I feel that there's sort of this disdain often from secondary to primary, that we're only cramming them. I think that's wrong, actually. But then there's also this sort of feeling from primary as we're sending them off into these kind of pretty poor secondary schools where Key Stage 3 is a bit rubbish. And and then they dip, and then all of a sudden it's cranked up again for GCSEs. And then these kids are plagued by their SATs results all the way through in terms of sets and stuff like that, which isn't their fault. It's probably down to what you were saying earlier, the ethos of the primary and whether the primary is good.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Paula. I mean, I did touch on this in my thesis, which I didn't really have time for today, but the transition element of Key Stage 2 to 3 obviously came up in the discussions and was something I touched on, that if you're going to plan a curriculum in this way, it relies on really good transition between primary and secondary and schools liaising and working together, which for some schools does happen, but for most is very difficult. And these two schools were doing their best, but they weren't that close. So the curriculum, especially in like the history thing, the curriculum falls down if there's not strong links and transitions. And I totally agree with that. In Key Stage 3, yeah, the fact there's no assessment at Key Stage 3 has led to the 3-year GCSE thing. I mean, I'm not arguing for more assessment at Key Stage 3 because when I was a teacher, we were glad to get rid of it. But I have Irish students on my PGCE course, and they're quite astonished that we don't assess in secondary school until the end of year 11. They said, well, you know, back in Ireland, we get a sort of equivalent to Key Stage 3 test, so you know how you're doing, and etc. So perhaps we're unusual in that sense, that we've got this big gap, and that perhaps that's why the SATs take on such a big picture for pupils, which sort of dogs them, as you say, moving forward. So I think, yeah, you're right, Paula. There's a whole transition issue there and links between the schools, and I do touch on that in the thesis. There's a whole other area, really.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paula. I'm just checking. Does anybody else who hasn't had an opportunity to ask a question so far? Does anybody have a burning desire to ask something? Okay, can I just sum up with one final question? It was inspired by Pete, but I had a similar question actually, and that is just if you can answer it in 1 minute. The idea of, you know, should teachers be critical of policy? And the one I was going to ask was, as you know, I've been doing some work in the prevent policy and how that's got infiltrated into the, you know, supporting fundamental British values teaching, promoting it in the classroom. So, you know, should teachers be critical? Because you said that your teachers weren't actually critical of the national curriculum. Do you think they should be?
Short answer is yes. They were critical assessments, how it had been written in history. That I've got some really interesting stuff off of those teachers. They weren't critical, perhaps I should clarify, they weren't critical of the concept of a national curriculum. So I was wondering if they would dismiss the whole idea, but none of them did. And perhaps that's just their age and how long they've been teaching. But all of them seemed to happy to accept the idea of a national curriculum, but they were critical of the content. There was some quite political stuff about why it had been introduced. As I said, Mr. Gove got mentioned a few times. So I think teachers haven't lost their criticality and their ability to adapt and change ideas. And if I can just finish going back to my friend, Mr. Basil Bernstein, he, in the pedagogic device, I do recommend you having a look at it if you got some time, if you've never heard of it. But he made a really interesting point. He says the pedagogic device, which he just says, he doesn't say is a good idea, by the way, he says has an inherent problem in that once you generate thinkable knowledge in the first part of the process, by definition, you are defining unthinkable knowledge. And therefore, it can be argued against all the way along because you're saying you're dismissing other approaches and other thoughts. And so there is the ability all the way through for teachers, exam boards, teacher training colleges, universities to disagree and to provide other alternative viewpoints, which I think is a positive place for us to end, possibly.
It certainly is. And apologies, Liz, I didn't bring you in. Did you want to just have a final comment or?
Sorry. No, I mean, obviously, there's been a couple of mentions of the history curriculum and the issue about chronological awareness. There was a rationale behind that. It was part of a wider debate, but we haven't got time for that now. Okay, take care.
Thanks, Liz.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Right, well, thank you. I'm sure we'd all like to join and say thank you very much, Steve. That was really, really very, very enlightening.